Good, so many of you. It's very good to see so many faces, and some of you may already know Professor Kenneth Stikkers from the inaugural lecture, which he delivered at our inauguration. This was dated the last day of September. So you already know how good a lecturer he is, and that it's going to develop relatively slowly, and then he's going to grasp your attention with every word, and then I don't know what it will end this with. It's a Caribbean slave trade and the spirit of capitalism. Yes, Hans Weber. Professor Stikkers is a philosopher, but he understands that you're not philosophers. So, and the Department of Philosophy, Carbondale, at the Southern Illinois University, is a peculiar place because they teach philosophy with a particular twist, pay attention to the cultural context. So that's very fitting into what we're doing here. So don't be discouraged by the fact that by training he is a philosopher and author of many books. Maybe some of you checked his profile. Professor of Social Sciences, you have a degree in Social Sciences?
I did interdisciplinary work. That was before I was in philosophy. I was in American Studies. So I did study at the University of Minnesota, where it all began.
But then it became cold. You moved a little bit south, to Southern Illinois. It's not too far from Carbondale. Is not too far from Memphis and Elvis. We were going to be hosting this May. When you see the registration, when you see the plan, and for the next semester, you will see that a friend of Professor Stikkers, Professor Randy Auxier, a musician, is going to come and teach a class in May. His whole class, 30 hours, will be in May. So Professor Auxier, or Auxier, does he ever say Auxier? No, Auxier, that's like W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes.
No one says Du Bois. Yes. So Professor Auxier is going to teach a class, and I encourage you to register for that class. I'm sure Ken will be coming back, since he's already been to Poland several times, and relations with the Department of Philosophy, but I'm absolutely certain that one day will be standing here in front of you teaching a regular class, and he's the president of the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy, and this is exactly what we'll be doing here. So we can sign the papers that advancing American philosophy. And Foucault, James, Puritanism, African-American philosophy, the list of things that Professor Stikkers has done and researched in his life is long, and everything he's done very well. So I hope he delivers this lecture equally well, and then you can say that I was right when I encouraged you to stay here for the lecture. And thank you very much for coming, and I'm just leaving the floor to you.
Thank you all for coming. How many of you have special interest in African American studies as part of your general American studies? Okay, and just a couple of you. Very important, extremely important part of American studies, the way in which American culture has been influenced by African traditions, and oddly, maybe not so oddly, really we're only starting to appreciate this in America. I think we've tended to see African people as having a distinct and separate culture, but I think only recently are we starting to look at how African people have affected the mainstream of American culture in a variety of ways. Have any of you studied them, specifically the slave trade? Is that something? So this is something fairly new to most of you. Okay. Extremely important. America, I think, is only now starting to come to terms with the legacy of slavery, oddly enough. I mean, it's over 150 years since the American Civil War that ended slavery, but the legacy of slavery is still with American society, and we haven't really faced it as we ought to. All right, my talk here looks at what is the relationship then between the slave trade and American capitalism. Now, defenders of capitalism and orthodox Marxists tend to agree that capitalism was a significant break from the systems of chattel slavery. Both defenders of capitalism and orthodox Marxists claim that there's a significant substantive difference between an economic system that commands and oppresses labor directly, on the one hand, chattel slavery, and one that commands labor indirectly through the private ownership of capital and a wage system. Although, of course, Marxists would claim that the institutions of capitalism are not that much better, if at all, than the institutions of chattel slavery. So the defenders of capitalism will commonly claim that the rise of capitalism is what ended slavery. It's common for them to say that slavery ended because of capitalism. Capitalism replaced a system in which human beings were owned with a system in which human beings are now rented, and that this is a significant advancement economically. Now, orthodox Marxists, and here I cite the American historian Eugene Genovese, he agrees that slavery in the Americas was pre-capitalist. It wasn't yet capitalism, it was pre-capitalist, and that capitalism brought chattel slavery to an end. Although, say, the defenders of capitalism and the orthodox Marxists would argue over whether there was any advantage in wage slavery over chattel slavery. What do I have to do?
Ruling
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
I will offer you some assistance.
It worked a minute ago. I just need to go down to the next slide. Well, I can just click it, really. Oh, there we go. Okay, now,
Just one?
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, now I just have to get into the right. Amen. Okay, so what I want to there's a fair amount of study that's been done on this. That is, what is the relationship between the history of the slave trade and American capitalism? There's a fair body of this. Most of the approaches to this topic look at it strictly from a material standpoint. In other words, the question they tend to ask was, did slavery provide the initial wealth that made capitalism possible? Or did capitalism develop its own internal wealth without the need of the slave system? All right? Now, I turn to a couple of people here, two economists from the Caribbean. One very, very important, if you are interested in this question, what's the relationship between capitalism and slavery? The essential text here is Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. Eric Williams was an economist from the island of Trinidad in the Caribbean, and he was the first president of Trinidad when Trinidad gained its independence from Great Britain in 1962. The other important person is also an economist from Trinidad, but he spent most of his life in the United States, and that is Oliver Cox. Now, both of these economists emphasize the material continuities between the slave trade and capitalism, and argue and show data that suggests that capitalism built itself upon the wealth that was created under the slave system. All right. Now, the pivotal, the pivotal problem, this is Cox speaking now. Cox writes that the pivotal problem faced by Marxian economists was that of breaking through. Yeah, I'm gonna. Claims that Marxian economists, the central problem to them was that of breaking through the labor, capital, commodity, surplus value frame of reference, which seemed to become more and more limiting and unrealistic. In other words, traditional Marxism had these ideological constraints that hindered an effective analysis of it. Cox goes on to say, though, it became apparent that the accumulated capital in leading capitalist nations was not all the product of its own factories. That was his conclusion. Some of it came from outside being from the slave trade. So that was Cox's central argument here. So, significant portions of the surplus value, the wealth upon which capitalism was built then, came from slavery. Now, what I want to do is offer a different sort of analysis here. That is, what I want to do is turn to the German sociologist Max Weber. Now, is that somebody who you have studied? How many of you have studied the figure Max Weber? Okay, absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. You cannot understand American culture without coming to terms with the Weber thesis in some way. It is so essential in understanding major portions of American history and American culture. His Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. All right? What I want to do here is offer an alternative analysis drawing from the works of Max Weber and suggest that, that his famous analysis of the spirit of capitalism, as opposed to the economic institutions of capitalism, opens another approach to this issue about what is the relationship of slavery to American capitalism. What I wanted to suggest here is the continuity of a common ethos. That is, what we can see in the slave trade is already the formation of what Max Weber identified as the spirit or ethos of capitalism, the value system of capitalism. All right, I break down the first part of the talk then deals with some background issues. Secondly, I'll say something about the Weber thesis itself. And then thirdly, what I want to do is show how the spirit of capitalism, as Weber described it, is manifest in the Caribbean slave trade. So as part of the background issues then, these are three of the fundamental questions of controversy. These are issues that are highly debated by historians and people in cultural studies. The first one I already alluded to. Did slavery make capitalism possible? Was capitalism built upon the back of slave labor? Remember, as I said, defenders of capitalism say no, that capitalism marks a complete rupture from the slave system, a completely different way of organizing economic life. And that, in fact, they'll claim that this was one of the great achievements of capitalism. It ended chattel slavery. Was capitalism surplus value, that is the wealth, the profit generated by necessary for building factories and so forth, was it self-generated, or did significant portion of it come from the slave trade? Second, then, was the slave system efficient in producing wealth and profit? Could the slaveholders in the American South have earned even greater wealth if they had given up slavery before the Civil War and instead went to hired labor? And thirdly, the question of racism. Is racism traceable largely to economic factors? This has been an ongoing major point of debate in African American history between those who, on the one hand, often influenced by Marx, who will say that racism is all about economics. It's all about economic exploitation. It's all about dividing the proletariat. That is, what race does is it pits black workers against white workers and allows then the capitalists to exploit both, because they're so busy fighting with each other that they can both be more easily exploited. Technique of divide and conquer. All right, so with regard to the background question, the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, who is one of the defenders of capitalism, and who credits and praises capitalism for ending slavery. And Mises is important because he is one of the most cited theorists today among American libertarians. He's one of the darlings of American libertarians. Figures like Paul Ryan and the Tea Party movement have been strongly influenced by Mises' theories. And so he's good to turn to because he illustrates this point of view, this first point. Mises says this. Mises claims that capitalism ended slavery. The abolition of slavery and serfdom is to be attributed neither to the teachings of the theologians and moralists, nor to weakness or generosity on the part of the masters. Servile labor, slavery, disappeared because it could not stand the competition of free labor. Free labor meaning hired labor. Servile labor disappeared because it could not stand the competition of free labor. Its unpredictability sealed its doom in the market economy. And then he goes on to say, now at no time and at no place was it possible for enterprises employing servile labor to compete on the market with enterprises employing free labor. In the production of articles of superior quality, an enterprise employing the apparently cheap labor of unfree workers, slaves, can never stand the competition of enterprises employing free labor. It is this fact that has made all systems of compulsory labor disappear. See, he's saying very, very clearly, capitalism was what ended slavery. Not the Civil War? No. Not the abolitionists? No. It was the simple fact that, that production using wage labor is more efficient and therefore will always outcompete labor performed by slaves. Now, I don't know what your response is to this, but I mean, I find this astounding. He claims it's a fact, but he doesn't offer any facts. He doesn't offer any kind of data to support his contention. It's an ideological claim. According to the theory of capitalism, it's supposed to be more efficient than slave labor, but he provides absolutely no economic data whatsoever to prove his point. The other thing I find astounding about this is that is he implicitly saying that the worst thing that a capitalist can say about chattel slavery is that it's inefficient? Is that really what's wrong with chattel slavery, is that it's inefficient? There's no basis for a moral critique in this approach to the subject. So those are a couple of things that I find rather astounding in Mises' analysis here of the situation. Now, with regard to the second point about the comparison of chattel slavery to a wage system. In the early 19th century, Orestes Bronson, somebody to become familiar with, probably the most important Catholic intellectual in America of the 19th century, and a critic of the British Industrial Revolution. He identified with the Chartist movement that was going on in England that was trying to reform the industrial system. And he identified himself as a Jacksonian Democrat. And Orestes Bronson, interestingly, opposed abolition. He said, look, don't end chattel slavery. Why? Because wage slavery is worse And decades before Karl Marx, Bronson was already using the term, was already using the expression wage slavery. Now that expression is usually attributed to Marx, but several decades before Marx ever used the term, we have this Jacksonian Democrat in America talking about wage slavery. Right? So with regards to this point, he says that he opposed abolition not because he supported chattel slavery, but because the free labor market system subjected African people to even greater oppression. And he claimed that chattel slavery was preferable to capitalism's wage slavery. And here he says, we say frankly, if there must always be a laboring population, distinct from proprietors and employers, we regard the slave system as decidedly preferable to the system of wages. Wages is a cunning device of the devil for the benefit of tender consciences who would retain all the advantages of the slave system without the expense, trouble, and odium of being slaveholders. So, in other words, he's claiming that a wage system gives to the proprietors all the advantages of a chattel slave system, but without a lot of the problems associated with that. Well, what are the problems associated with that? How about just keeping the slaves alive? Because part of the argument is this, is that under a system whereby one class owns labor, owns a group of people, they have an investment in those people. So it's in the interest of the slaveholder to at least keep the slave alive, provide a minimum subsistence for the slave. But when the labor is rented through wages, the employer doesn't care whether that person lives or dies, as long as there are other people to take his or her place. All right? So that's part of the argument, is that that the slave owner at least has it in his own self-interest to protect his investment and to provide the slave with minimum subsistence, but those who rent labor through wages don't care if the laborers live or die as long as they can be replaced. Now, after Reconstruction, following the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877, assuming a number of you are familiar with that episode, that was the effort after the American Civil War to rebuild the South and to try to provide the kinds of institutions that would allow the newly freed African American population to assume the responsibilities of citizenship. But following the collapse of Reconstruction, the African-American former slave, Frederick Douglass, the most important figure in the period of the Civil War, alongside Abraham Lincoln, he agreed with Bronson. Frederick Douglass in 1888 agreed with what Bronson said. The Negro is worse off in many respects than when he was a slave. He is the victim of a cunningly devised swindle, one which paralyzes his energies, suppresses his ambition, and blasts all his hopes, and though he is nominally free, he is actually still a slave. I here and now denounce this so-called emancipation as a stupendous fraud. A fraud upon him, a fraud upon the world. With slavery, the old slaveholders had some care and responsibility for the physical well-being of their slaves because they were investments. It was in their own interest to at least keep them alive. But now they have as firm a grip on the freeman's labor as when he was a slave, and without any burden of caring for his children or himself. This famous address, I denounce the so-called emancipation as a stupendous fraud. So, Douglass agrees with Bronson that the system of wage slavery is actually worse than chattel slavery. All right. More recently, the historian Robert Fogel along with Stanley Engerman, demonstrated upon empirical evidence, this was back in the 1970s already, demonstrated with empirical evidence enough to win a Nobel Prize. Vogel received the Nobel Prize in 1963 for this study that he did on the comparative efficiency of the slave system. And his data suggested that the slave system was in fact a very efficient system, efficient in terms of generating profit and wealth. Now, he was criticized, his study was criticized by many people, including the African-American historian John Hope Franklin, because they thought that, well, this justifies slavery then, doesn't it? To say that slavery was an efficient system of economic production, doesn't that justify slavery? And Vogel said, no, just the opposite. This is a condemns capitalism. In other words, if your only measure of what's good for the economy is profit, then it would seem that by capitalist standards, slavery was a good thing. And clearly, for Vogel, that's not the case. He was the pioneer of what's now called cliometrics, the application of quantitative methods like those used in economics and other social sciences to history. And so his work was a pioneer work in many ways. Now, Vogel's study was written in part as a response to earlier empirical studies by the Southern historian and apologist for slavery and the Confederacy, Ulrich Bonnell Phillips. This is in the 19th century. Now, prior to Phillips, even though, the Southern abolitionist and cousin of Henry Clay, Cassius Marcellus Clay, first argued in a widely distributed article entitled "Slavery, the Evil and the Remedy," that not only was slavery immoral, but it was also an inefficient and wasteful system, in agreement, contrary rather, to Vogel. And that's what Vogel is responding to. Phillips concluded that slavery had been, at one time, a relatively efficient economic system within its own historical context and had produced great wealth for the United States. But it had become relatively inefficient in comparison to the new industrial capitalism that was emerging. So in its own time, it's saying that, yes, the slave system was very efficient at producing wealth, but these new systems of industrial production are more efficient. So comparatively, it's now relatively inefficient. Now, so in agreement then with some of Mises' claims then, Phillips further concluded that capitalism would have defeated slavery without there having to be a civil war in America, and that therefore the Civil War was unnecessary and unwarranted aggression on the part of the North. There was no need for a civil war because the efficiency of capitalism would end slavery. The Southern slave owners would see that an economic system that paid people to work was more efficient than an economic system in which human beings were owned, and therefore the slave owners themselves would give up slavery in favor of a wage system. And so his point was that the Civil War was all unnecessary. It was just the desire on the part of the North to exert greater control over the South. So what is most relevant to my analysis here in this debate about the relative efficiency or inefficiency of American slavery is this. If slavery was an inefficient system, but Southern slaveholders nonetheless clung to it, even though they were seeing that it was inefficient, they still clung to it, what would that say about the sources of race and racism? It would seem to suggest that racism isn't about economics, right? Because if racism were about economics, then wouldn't and the slave system was proven to be inefficient, then it would seem the slaveholders would be giving it up. and going to a system of competitive wages. So it would suggest that, it suggests that slaveholders are not primarily motivated by profits, but by other psychological factors, such as the need to dominate and to feel superior to other people. For slaves were not primarily then instruments of profit, but tokens of social status. All right? So if it was the case that they were clinging to the slave system despite its inefficiencies, that would suggest that race and racism is not about economics, it's psychology. It's about wanting to feel superior to other people. So that would seem to follow from Clay's and Phillips' arguments. By contrast, though, if Fogel and Engerman are correct, that is, that slavery was a very efficient system, that slaveholders were indeed motivated strongly by profit, and that the slave system was highly profitable, then their argument would suggest that slavery and capitalism go together, or of the same fabric. That is, that slave trade was as governed by the desire for profits as much as the industrial capitalism. So as Fogel and Engerman then conclude, they say that there is considerable evidence that slave owners were hard, calculating businessmen who priced slaves and their other assets with as much shrewdness as could be expected by any northern capitalists. So in other words, the behavior of the southern slave owners was not that different from the behavior of the northern capitalists. That they were out for profit just as much as the northern industrialists. So some of this is the relevant background regarding discussion about the relationship of slavery to capitalism. To what extent is the latter continuous with the former? To what extent does it mark a radical break? In this regard, then, I propose that Max Weber's famous study of the spirit or ethos of capitalism provides an important alternative approach to the matter, and as I indicated, I argue that the Caribbean slave trade is in fact a manifestation of the spirit of capitalism. We can see the spirit of capitalism, the mindset of capitalism at work in the slave trade. So, turning to the Weber thesis then. And I'll keep this part fairly short. Central to Weber's analysis is a clear separation he makes of capitalism understood as a set of, as an economic system and set of institutions, right? So we can talk about capitalism as a set of institutions, the institutions of private property, for example, forms of finance, and so forth, on the one hand. Unregulated markets, and so forth. But then what Weber points to is capitalism as an ethos, that is, as a system of values that has profit-making, wealth-getting as its highest value. An ethos or value system that sees money-making, profit-making as the highest value in life. Indeed, the spirit of capitalism, Weber claims, he's quoting Weber, was present before the capitalist order. In other words, before there were capitalist institutions, like private property and so forth, there was already developing the ethos or value system that would go with these institutions. As before there were capitalist institutions such as exclusive private property and unfettered markets, there was this mindset forming. He goes on to say the summum bonum, that is the highest good of this ethic, the spirit of capitalism, is the making of more and more money combined with the strict avoidance of all spontaneous enjoyment of life. In other words, you're supposed to make as much money as you can, but don't enjoy it. To keep using that money to make endlessly more and more money. Man is dominated by the making of money by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of his life. Economic acquisition is no longer subordinated to man as the means for the satisfaction of his material needs. In other words, it's an ethos that sees money-making as its own end or purpose. What do we want all this money for? I don't know. It's seen as good in itself. The more, the better. All right? The spirit of capitalism, however, is more than merely the impulse for material gain. It is first such an impulse detached from any sort of personal enjoyment other than the sense of satisfaction that comes from success in money-making itself. The money-making itself provides the satisfaction. All right? It is materialism without sensuality, as Weber puts it, without affect, without any kind of feeling. It's just this cold, calculating mind constantly thinking, how can I make more and more and more money without limit? What am I going to do with it? I don't know. I just know I want more and more and more of it. Is it going to make me happier? I don't know. I just want more of it. That's the spirit of capitalism. All right? So this is quoting Weber again, the impulse to acquisition, pursuit of gain of money, of the greatest amount of money, has in itself nothing to do with capitalism as a set of institutions. That impulse is found throughout human history. The impulse for gain is found throughout human history. But what Weber thinks really distinguishes this impulse for gain under capitalism, the ethos of capitalism, from the desire for wealth in the past is that, quoting Weber again, it is identical with pursuit of profit and forever renewed profit by means of continuous, rational, capitalistic enterprise. In other words, what Weber underscores is the rationality that goes into this money-making. That is, organizing your life around a strict, rational structure that allows you to be maximally efficient and to make as much money as possible. It's this hyper-rationality that he thinks is really the most defining feature of the spirit of capitalism. We can find greedy individuals throughout human history. That's not what makes for the spirit of capitalism. It's this strict, rational structure by which the wealth is to be made. So the spirit of capitalism, Weber tells us, is a strange mixture of reason and unreason. It is the strict, rational organization of life in service to a completely irrational goal of unlimited monetary gain for its own sake. Okay, so it says, organize your life according to a strict regiment of rationality and efficiency for the sake of earning as much money for its own sake. A completely irrational goal. What's the point of earning endlessly more and more money? Particularly if it doesn't make you happy. All right? So this ethos, Weber famously demonstrated, is rooted in Calvinism. That is, in the religious belief that worldly success is a sign of predestined salvation. How did this ethos come about? Well, he really points the finger at Calvinism, wherein the acquisition of wealth was interpreted, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, as a sign that that a person is one of God's chosen people. That God looks favorably upon those who are wealthy. This is his sign that they are his chosen. So he says, the God of Calvinism demanded of his believers not single good works, but a life of good works combined into a unified system. That is, a tightly, rationally organized system. And by good works, over time, this becomes identified more and more with profit-making. All right? So, rationalism, that is the effort to subject everything, nature, human beings, to a rule of reason as key to the good life, Weber suggests, is the defining feature of Western culture generally. But what marks Western culture generally is this sense of rationalism, wanting to put everything into a rational order, is what sets Western culture apart from others. But now here in the spirit of capitalism, that rationalism is given a religious fervor. It's combined with religion in a way that raises it to a new level. But in the spirit of capitalism, this rationalism, as old as Western philosophy itself, is brought to bear upon commercial activities to an unprecedented degree and infused with a religious fervor. The pursuit of unlimited wealth is to be pursued in accord with principles of exact calculation, with the urgency that comes from nothing less than one's eternal salvation lying in the balance. In other words, people pursue wealth with the same kind of energy and enthusiasm that previous generations pursued salvation. Success, economic success, becomes really the new version of salvation. Because in Calvinism, these two become linked together. That monetary success is a sign of your religious salvation. A life lived in strict conformity to an unfeeling, calculating logic fixed on unlimited gain and never questioning itself is the surest sign that one is among God's elect, predestined for salvation. Weber's analysis thus exposes Europe's boasted reason for what it is, a calculus for subordinating and harnessing human life to the machine of economic production. And the accountant thus emerges as the new priest of this new church of capitalism. It's the accountant who keeps the sacred books, which exhibit the signs of election, and his art of bookkeeping is the prime embodiment of this cold, calculated pursuit of wealth. So it's this cold, calculating feeling with which wealth is pursued that is ultimately the defining mark of the spirit of capitalism. So Weber describes the spirit of capitalism with this oxymoron, worldly asceticism. Worldly success was valued not for the hedonistic pleasure it might bring, but because of its symbolic value in identifying those who are predestined for otherworldly salvation. So those infused with this spirit saw themselves as working tirelessly in the world, but not of it. The spirit of capitalism thus encouraged an eerie emotional detachment from the worldly activities in which it encouraged its devotees to succeed. Quoting Weber, petrification embellished with a sort of convulsive self-importance, specialist without spirit, sensualist without heart, this nullity imagines it has achieved a level of civilization never before achieved. So although rooted in Calvinism, the spirit of capitalism, Weber describes, took on a life of its own. Already by the early 18th century, its mandate to work relentlessly for unlimited worldly success in accord with a strict rational regimen became a self-evident truth. So even though people were no longer religious, people were falling away from this Calvinist religion that sanctified money making as a sign of salvation, it became something that was just part of everyday life. Right? So it became a self-evident truth, no longer in need of theological justification. It thus took on secular form and spread even to non-Calvinist people, although nowhere else exhibiting the degree and intensity that it finds among the British. So, take a figure like Donald Trump. I submit, here's a prime embodiment of what Weber was describing. This cold, calculating spirit, this unfeeling way in which one goes about business, goes about making money. More and more money endlessly for its own sake. All right? And that, in fact, what we see is, if you were to, you have this impression, if you saw Donald Trump, particularly if you didn't have any sound, you couldn't hear what he was saying, what would you think you were watching? Huh? A comedy. All right. Besides that, anything else? Could you imagine that you were watching one of these fundamentalist ministers? Exactly. He has all the mannerisms of a 19th century Puritan minister. He even dresses like a Puritan minister. I mean, that's in fact where the business dress comes from, historically, in American culture, where businessmen trying to gain respectability would imitate the dress of the clergy. All right? So you have it there in the figure of Donald Trump, this spirit of capitalism. All All right, third part, the concluding part. Then, the spirit of capitalism as a manifestation of the Caribbean slave trade. How many of you are familiar with this figure? Any of you seen it before? Okay. Again, if you're in American Studies, this is a must. You must know this figure. This is the design of the slave ship, the Brooks. And I don't know how well you can see the figures here, but each one of these marks is a human body, lying shoulder to shoulder in the hull of the slave ship. What's striking about it? What I submit is what I just described from Max Weber, about the eerie, cold, calculating mentality of the spirit of capitalism. Human beings reduced to the logic of efficiency. How can we cram as many bodies into this ship as possible so as to make as much money? Shoulder to shoulder, they will lie chained together, 2 feet 7 inches of space above them, so not enough space to sit up, and forced to lie in such a position for possibly months on end as they're transported from Africa to the Caribbean. Because it was in the Caribbean where the African captives were broken. That is, their spirit was broken. They were separated from other people who shared their same language, and in the effort of making them slaves. Okay? So the Caribbean slave trade, what I want to submit, as practiced by especially the Protestant British, exhibits what Weber describes as the spirit of capitalism in at least 3 ways. We see this spirit, first of all, in the design of the slave ship itself. Second, we see it in the subjection of the lives of the slaves to the strict rational calculus of the balance sheet. Human lives are made into a number on the balance sheet. And third, the coldly rational detachment of the slave merchant and the slave ship captains. I remember as an undergraduate student, I first saw that image of the Brook and was horrified. It was not only that so many bodies were crammed into such a tight space and in such inhuman conditions. I mean, they would lie there in their own excrement and urine. Often, there's nowhere to go, no bathrooms to go to, no bathroom breaks. It wasn't just these inhuman conditions, but as I said, it's the cold, calculative manner by which human beings were tortuously reduced to mere cargo. They're just like crates of fruit or something. How many can we cram in? The earliest slave ships had been merely ordinary cargo vessels. In the beginning of the slave trade, they just took ordinary cargo vessels and then tried to get in as many people as they could. But the British saw that this was not very efficient, since human bodies cannot be piled into the hull of a ship on top of each other like you could sugar or cotton or cases of rum. So ships were designed specifically to transport a maximum of human cargo. A Scottish abolitionist described the slave ship as a rigorous economy, wherein, quote, no place capable of holding a single person from one end of the vessel to the other is less unoccupied. And then this is from the abolitionist John Newton, who was a slave merchant. He was engaged in the slave trade and then had a change of conscience. So he saw this firsthand, and one of our best accounts of the slave trade comes from Newton, where he read that crew members were instructed to lay them, that is the slaves, in these rows to the greatest advantage so that as little space as possible might be lost. Let it be observed that the poor creatures thus cramped for want of room are likewise in irons, for the most part, both hands and feet, and 2 together, which makes it difficult for them to turn or move, to attempt either to rise or to lie down, with hurting them or each other. Maximum efficiency, cold calculating logic, dictates the design of the slave ship. The historian Marcus Radiker then wrote, the slave ship worked as a machine to produce the commodity slave for a global label market. In other words, he invites us to imagine the slave ship as something like a floating factory that takes in human beings and then turns them into human capital. That is, turns them into a product to be bought and sold. All right? So a violence of enslavement and a violence of abstraction developed together and reinforced each other. The slave ship embodied the brutal logic and cold, rational mentality, the features that I said, that Weber ascribes to the spirit of capitalism. Right? That's the essence of the spirit of capitalism. Brutal logic, cold, rational mentality of the merchant's business. The process by which human beings were reduced to property, by which labor was made into a thing, a commodity shorn of all ethical considerations. It's all about economics, it's all about business, no ethics here. Okay? In a troubled era of transition from a moral to a political conception of economy, the Brooks represented a nightmarish outcome of the process. Here was the new modern economic system in all its horrifying nakedness, capitalism without a loincloth. Right? It views the cold, calculating, brutal logic that's to dominate it. So the slave ship manufactured commodified labor, which the theories and institutions of capitalism would take for granted and Marx would criticize. And Weber enables us to see the ethos, the logic that preceded and made possible such commodification. Where did this mindset come from that says that we can impose this brutal, cold logic upon human beings and treat human beings just as objects of trade? Recently, the historian Caitlin C. Rosenthal has shown that that many of the techniques pioneered by slave owners in the 1800s are widely used in business management today. Southern plantation owners kept complex and meticulous records, measuring the productivity of their slaves and carefully monitoring their profits, often using even more sophisticated methods than manufacturers in the North. Several of the slave owners' practices, such as incentivizing workers, in this case to get them to pick more cotton, and depreciating their worth through the years, are widely used in business management today. In other words, what Rosenthal shows in her forthcoming book is that slaveholders were already learning in the 19th century what 20th century behavioral psychologists would confirm, and that is that regimens, systems of punishment are much less effective methods for controlling people than granting and withholding favors, say through a paycheck, for example. So we see the rationalist spirit of capitalism in the design of the slave ship, not only in its optimally efficient use of space, but also in the careful design for protection against frequent revolts, which occurred on 1/5 to 1/3 of all voyages. And so 1/3 to 1/5, or 1/5 to 1/3 of all of the voyages of the slave ships, there were revolts by the slaves. And so the design of the ships had to anticipate that. And such design is most clearly visible in the structure of the barricado. The barricado was a, if it comes through here, was a spring-loaded fence that would shoot up, a spike fence that would shoot up across the deck here to separate the crew. This would be the crew, they pick up their guns and they could shoot down onto the lower deck on the revolting slaves. So what I'm saying is in the design of the ship was already the mechanism for repressing revolt. Now, crew members were sometimes caught on the wrong side of the barricado, as you can imagine. This is a spring-loaded thing. It shoots up and boop, and they'd be fought on. But too bad. That's part of the calculus. That was part of the calculus. Okay, and that's just a cost of production that some of the crew members would have to be sacrificed. And so that cold logic is most clearly visible, however, though, in the calculation of lives. So we see in other words, we see the spirit of capitalism as described by Weber in the design of the slave ship, but now also in the calculation of lives. Now the slave traders, they didn't know much about microbiology. They did not understand how diseases spread, but they did know that diseases spread more quickly in denser populations. So in other words, the slave ship designers knew that if you pack more people together in these inhumane conditions, like I say, there's no sanitation or anything, a lot of people are going to die from the spread of diseases. So they asked themselves, would it be better to design the ships so that they carry fewer people and provide space for healthier conditions? Should we design the ships so that as many people will survive the voyage as possible? Or should we design the ships to cram in as many people as possible, knowing that 1/3 to 1/2 of the people will die? What should we do? Well, they calculated it. They calculated it and concluded that it was more profitable to let as many as 1/2 of the slaves die. We'll still make more money than putting bearing the expense of a more spacious ship. So John Newton reports that nearly 1/2 of the slaves on board have sometimes died, and that the loss of the third is not unusual. This is a picture of a 15-year-old girl being punished. Let's see now. Okay. Ah, here. Here's Newton again saying, calculations had been made with all possible exactness to determine which was the preferable, that is, the more saving method of managing slaves, which will be more profitable. Whether to appoint them moderate work, plenty of provision, and such treatment, or might enable them to protect their lives to old age. Right? Should we try to keep them alive as long as possible, as healthy as possible? Or by rigorously straining their strength to the utmost with little relaxation, hard fare, and hard usage to wear them out before they became useless and unable to do service, and then to buy new ones to fill up their places. Skillful calculators had determined in favor of the latter mode as much the cheaper. So the British carefully calculated that it's better to let 1/3 to 1/2 of the slaves die than it is to bear the expense of ensuring that as many live as possible. This is what I mean by subjecting human lives to the balance sheet. Okay, Newton claims, and this has been disputed by some, but he claims that if you compare British slave trade to the Portuguese, for example, you see the difference. The Portuguese structured their slave ships and their plantations to try to keep the slaves alive as long as possible, to keep them as healthy as possible. They went that route. The British, it's all about profit and do whatever it takes. The enslaved African prince, Olaudah Equiano, and here's a very important source on the slave trade, the autobiography of Equiano, testifies that the British plantation owners in the Caribbean calculated that it was more economical to work slaves to death and then replace them than to maintain their health. Hence, very few slaves survived more than 9 years after arrival. Such was the British slave traders' cold calculation of the slaves' lives. The third way in which the spirit of capitalism shows itself in the slave trade, and this is the most chilling and horrifying. The cold rationality of the slave trade showed itself in the calculated ways that those involved administered torture so as to maximize the terror. That's a quotation from Newton. Administer torture so as to maximize the terror, and thereby maintain control over the ship's cargo, and correspondingly their deadening of all compassion for the slaves in order to do so. All right, what's the best way to control these slaves? Terrorize them. Terrorize any thought of revolt out of them. How? Well, we'll see. So slave ship captains referred to themselves as hell masters. We're going to create hell for them. And they saw their primary task as terrorizing all thoughts of rebellion out of the slaves' minds and thereby terrorizing them into submission. John Newton, then again, who was the chief mate on the slave ship the Brownlow, and he was famous for writing an American hymn, Amazing Grace. He was the author of the famous song, Amazing Grace. He commented that successful captains, such as his own captain, Richard Jackson, had, quote, studied with no small attention how to make death as excruciating as possible. Catch that? How do you become a successful slave ship captain? You learn how to make death as excruciating as possible. The tactics for doing so included thumbscrews, the raping of women slaves, and, quote, unmerciful whippings continued till the poor creatures have not had power to groan. I think I have this. Yeah. Unmerciful whippings until the poor creatures have no strength less even to groan. And hardly a sign of life remained. Not even the children were spared. Okay, hence that image there of a 15-year-old girl being tortured. At the first sign of rebellion, Jackson would make an example of a group of the slaves by jointing them. In other words, so if there was any sign of rebellion, what would he do? He would take one or more of the slaves and make an example of them. And he'd have all of the other slaves gather on deck and to show them what would happen to them if they had any thoughts of rebelling. And the tactic that he used was called jointing. With an axe, he would cut off parts of their bodies, ending with the head, and throwing each piece into the crowd of the slaves who were assembled on deck and forced to witness the torturous execution. So they'd execute the person by hacking him to death, cutting off pieces of his body, relatively small pieces at a time, and then throwing them into the crowd. Again, this is what will happen to you if you have any thoughts of rebelling. Okay. Such cruelty, Newton suggested, did not come naturally to the captains. It was not a matter of only sadistic personalities being selected as captains. You know, how did you get people like this to be captains? Did you go out there and see who are the most sadistic, evil people you can find, and then you make them your ship captains? No. No. You take ordinary people and you teach them to be sadists. Now, this is what Newton says, and this is what several other observers also say, including Equiano. Rather, they had to be bred up in a systematic manner. Newton writes, the captains are brought up in the business and pass through the several stages of apprentices, foremastermen and mates, before they are masters and gradually acquire a cruel disposition together with their knowledge of the trade. They're taught to be cruel. The historian Radiker adds, learning cruelty was intrinsic to learning the trade itself. So racializing the cruelty and terrorism facilitated their teaching. It was somewhat easier to inflict torture upon a racialized other. In other words, it would be easier to inflict torture upon those black folks who were seen as subhuman. As you can convince the crew that because they're black, they're less human. That made it a little bit easier to inflict this torture. But the coldly calculative logic of the slave trade could not be stopped at any racial line, and the white European sailors also suffered its cruelty. Crew members who failed to exercise strict control over their human cargo were also made examples of in ways almost as horrific as those applied to the slaves. So if a crew member didn't do his job, he could be subjected to, maybe not quite as severe as the jointing, but pretty severe punishment. And as mentioned earlier, they were readily sacrificed during slave rebellions. Furthermore, slave ship captains, especially near the end of voyages, would often see their sailors as unnecessary expenses and hence as expendable, or they simply would not want to pay them. So sailors were often left on deserted islands to fend for themselves or simply dumped overboard to drown. This is an expense. We don't need so many sailors. You know, we're almost home. Get rid of. Okay, so some of them were just dumped overboard or left on desert islands. Indeed, casualty rates among crew members were often as high as those among the slaves. Almost as high a percentage of the crew died in the transition. All part of the cost of business. Thus, the terrorism of the slave trade was not a matter of the cruel conduct of a few individuals, as William Ley observed in 1787. Rather, it was, quote, the general cruelty of the system. A system whose perverse logic brutalized both the human cargo and the crews of the slave ship. Indeed, some of those engaged in the slave trade, such as the seaman Silas Todd in 1734, expressed awareness of what the slave trade was doing to sailors and admitted that the engagement had made them more barbarous than they ever presumed their African captives to be. In other words, part of the logic said, well, it's okay to abuse these people because they're just barbarians anyway. But even the slave crew members started to say, well, wait a minute, what we're doing to these people is more barbarous, it's more horrific than we imagined them to be. Okay, so Europe's rationality, which European peoples boasted, was supposed to make them superior to those whom they were conquering and thereby justify their conquest, was by some sailors' own admission robbing them of their humanity. Newton writes, I know of no method of getting money, not even that of robbery, which has a more direct tendency to efface the moral sense, to rob the heart of every gentle and human disposition, and to harden it like steel against all impressions of sensibility. So, conclude, thus, contrary to those like von Mies, who claim that capitalism's rise marked a radical break from systems of chattel slavery, I've suggested here that viewing capitalism, as did Max Weber, primarily as a spirit or ethos, marked by a coldly calculating rationalism in service to unlimited wealth accumulation, reveals the Caribbean slave trade as a manifestation of capitalist rationalism. Such rationalism is manifest in this threefold way, as I described. First, in the design of the slave ship, which reduced the captured human beings to expendable commodities, to mere cargo. Second, the reduction of the slaves' lives to the calculus of the balance sheet. And thirdly, the coldly rational detachment of those who participated in the slave ship, whereby they inflicted horrific tortures upon their captives in a rationally calculated manner designed to suppress any rebelliousness. Weber had famously characterized capitalism's rationalistic spirit with what he called an iron cage. He referred to the spirit of capitalism as an iron cage. But here I've suggested that it also manifests itself not as a metaphor, but in the wooden cage that was the slave ship. Thank you. Some of the references that I made, some select ones, some of the more important ones. So if you want to make note of that. So we have time for questions.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you think of questions?
Okay. I had several questions, but as you were talking, a lot of my doubts were sort of answered, and I ended up with all several questions dwindled down to only one. And I was thinking that we normally associate Calvinism and the Protestant ethic with the North. And you talked, and I thought maybe that's the reason why you talk about slave trade and not about chattel slavery on plantations. Am I right thinking that there may have been clashes between the way Southerners handled slaves on plantations? Was the chattel slavery culture on plantations somewhat different from the British rationality, Protestant rationality on ships?
Because of religious differences.
Because of religious differences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, you're right. We associate Calvinism with the North, with the New England North. But though the majority of the slave owners, though, came from Presbyterian backgrounds, they were Calvinists too. And so the South became increasingly so. So, I mean, so today in the United States, the strongest bastion of Calvinism is actually in the South. Today, there's been this dramatic, change, and in the fundamentalist religions that we find in the South. So the largest ethnic group of the slave owners, they were Presbyterian Scottish, and so they very much were carriers of this Calvinist this ethic. But as I indicated, though, that even though it had religious origins, though, it spread. It was a spirit that spread to non-Calvinist people and even to secular people, which is why Weber himself uses Ben Franklin as his primary example of the spirit of capitalism. Because Franklin wasn't an especially religious person, but he was infected with this spirit of capitalism, just like Donald Trump. I mean, although he came from a Presbyterian, a Calvinist background, but he's not a highly religious person. He says he attends church when it's convenient. That's what he says. But he sure looks like a Calvinist minister, and he sure is, in my judgment, a primary embodiment of this spirit of capitalism.
Can I ask a practical question? You talk about the profit and half of the slaves might die in the process of transportation. Give us some figures. How much did the slave cost in an African coast? Yes. And how much would be gotten for that slave for that person being transported to the States? I understand that there is a different price for a woman, for a man, for a healthy, for a big, for a child, but on average.
No. I'm not sure if I can tell you, well, let's say what we know is that, many of the slaves were acquired by, Africans themselves raiding the neighboring village of some other tribe that maybe they had tensions with or something like that, and then they would sell them to the slave traders on the coast. I'm not sure if I can tell you what is there. What I do know, though, is that at the high end, we have records of some slaves selling at auction in the United States for as much as $3,000 in 1860. That would be like $250,000 today, if not more. That's the high end. More normal, you would find more in the amount of maybe $600, but as you indicate, there's wide variance. There's wide variance. How old is the slave? How physically fit are they? And so forth. So there's a lot of variance, but that would be...
So no wonder then, going back to Dr. Koch's observation, when you already purchased them and you have them on plantation, yes, they become a very expensive investment.
Yes.
So you have to look after them.
Right. And that's part of Bronson's and Douglas's argument as to why chattel slavery might be a more humane system. As awful as it was, it might be a more humane system because at least the slave owner wants to protect his investment. Whereas if you're renting labor, you don't care if that person dies.
As long as there is someone to replace.
Exactly, as long as there's someone to replace them.
Well,
I have a question. I think I partly agree with this idea that racism came somehow from slavery or because of the slavery. Because as we were discussing it previously, you said that in historical texts, dark-skinned people weren't perceived as so much inferior as later on during the slavery.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, what would you say about what do you think about
This is one of the most debated issues right now in African American studies, and it's the question of, did racism begin with the slave trade? Did racism begin with the slave trade? For many years, up until recently, the general consensus was yes, that racism is a function of slavery. That is, that if you can racialize who it is that you're going to enslave, right, you can more easily identify than the people. You solve the problem of people running away and blending in and so forth. And so for a long time, this was held. And a lot of the evidence was then based upon analysis of classical texts, going back to ancient Greece and Rome, and to ancient times, and seeing and even medieval times, and saying, well, we know that the Greeks and Romans were in contact with Africa. They had commerce with Africa. That they were familiar with black-skinned people. What did they think of them, and so forth? And the text seemed to suggest that they didn't think of them as being inferior or anything like that, just different. That's all. I mean, we know that dark-skinned Africans were in the Roman legions. They were gladiators and so forth. They were part of of Roman life, and it appears to be on an equal basis. There's been some new scholarship, which I haven't looked at carefully. I just know the general argument, so I can't have an opinion on this yet. I'm not sure yet if I'm persuaded, but there's been recently new scholarship that has re-examined these old sources and suggests that, no, you can find racism going all the way back to antiquity. You can find in Greco-Roman times racist attitudes already. So this is a big point of debate right now. And as I say, I'm not completely up to date on the literature that's come out on that, so I have to refrain from judgment. But I was of the older opinion. I thought it was obvious that racism came about as a result of slavery, but that's being challenged. People especially surprised by some of this? Is some of this surprising, shocking, new? I mean, you all are familiar with slavery and and know that's part of the American experience, but the brutality of it is.
I found it really surprising, but I was wondering about the Portuguese slave trade.
Yeah.
I remember you mentioned at some point that the Portuguese ships were not nearly as well organized as the British ones. Did the Portuguese find themselves competing against the British, and they eventually decided they had to adopt the British ways, or how did that work?
Not that I'm aware of. As I say, the sources that I read, and those would be some of the accounts like Newton's of people who were involved in the slave trade, and also some of the journals or the autobiographical accounts by some of the slaves themselves, like Equiano. Many of them make this comparison and claim that the Portuguese system was less brutal, that they organized the system, they say, to keep alive as many people as possible to help the slaves along. Now, I've presented this in other places, including Brazil, and I had a number of people say, wait a minute, there are some other sources you need to look at. So I'm open to that. So maybe that part is wrong. I just know that from the British sources that I've read, that seems to be the clear case, but I've been challenged on that by people who read Portuguese and so could read the Portuguese records, and they suggest that maybe this is one-sided.
I'd like to ask a question that sort of moves beyond the scope of your topic tonight, but I'm asking because of the philosophical sort of part of your argument, which is that for me the kind of hyper-rational way of organizing the transportation of those people and so on. It's sort of inevitable today, I think, that we think also of something like the Nazi genocide of the Jews and so on. And of course, there have been analyses from notably Horkheimer and Adorno that talk about rationality and kind of runaway rationality that becomes irrationality. And so there are, it seems to be, clear analogies to the arguments that you talked about. But clearly there isn't a kind of economic incentive to the Holocaust. So I wonder how that later example might impact the philosophical thinking behind your
Good point. Well, I mean, the history of capitalism was led by British industry, and so we usually think of England as being the vanguard of capitalism, and especially the spirit of capitalism. But Germany is close behind. I mean, it was also a Protestant country, although more Lutheran than Calvinist. So it should not be surprising to find in Germany some of the same kind of hyper-rationalism, say, but as you point out, though, it's tied to nationalism and things like that rather than to economics. We also know, though, that the Nazis were very much interested in the slave trade. How were slaves managed? How did you break people's spirits and so forth? And they studied, many of their scholars studied very carefully the slave trade, but also the genocide of native people. And in fact, one of the things they learned from their study of the treatment of the indigenous people of the Americas, and that is that how removing people from their homeland is one of the most effective ways to break their spirit. That relocating people is one of the most profound things you can do to break a person's spirit and desire to revolt and resist. So I'm not sure, I think that gets directly at your question there about the difference, but I just cite that as some further similarities of how this spirit of capitalism, again understood as this hyper-rationalism, this reduction of human life to a strict calculating logic, yes, can certainly be seen in the Nazi death camps, and the way in which they carried out torture and execution with this same kind of cold, calculating logic. But as you indicated, it wasn't in the service of profit, but in the service of nationalistic interests.
One wonders how they, how the Nazi found the story of Native Americans dislocated in America useful to think about the Jewish diaspora in Europe.
Yeah.
In terms of belonging to a place.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is something we have a fair amount of evidence on. This was studied quite carefully. How did they break their spirits? But Rosenthal's studies are interesting there too, because she's showing how how early business, how early management theory in business looked to the slave trade, how were the plantations managed and so forth. And of course, the question is, how do you make people docile? How do you break their spirit of independence? And so many of those same techniques then were taken up in early systems of management in America, which spread, of course, around the world. And so I think we have to ask, well, how much of this is still with us? How much of this is still with us in contemporary capitalism?
I think we have time for one more question. So.
Yeah, I have one. I'm not exactly familiar with the Calvinist denomination or Protestant religion, but I'm wondering, were these people considering themselves still religious, doing such horrific things? How were they justifying it? Or were they just treating the dark-skinned people as, I don't know, how did they justify it in their minds?
Right. Well, this is what makes Newton rather interesting, is because he has a dramatic change of conscience. I mean, where he is one of the people who says, how can I, as a Christian, be doing this?
Exactly.
Yeah. But there were so many who somehow were able to separate the two. But we see that throughout. We see it with the genocide of Native American people, for example. Good Christian people. Sometimes even saying this is being done in the name of Christianity. This is going on. It's amazing to me. But here Weber is also helpful too, because he points out this ethic, this ethos of capitalism. Even though it begins in religion, it takes on a life of its own. It becomes so much a part of the culture that it no longer requires its connection to religion. And so I think that's a big part of the story too. So many of these people may have come from that Calvinist background, but they no longer have much awareness of its theology or anything. But what they have adopted is this idea of living life in accord with this strict, cold logic aimed at maximizing wealth, maximizing profit, no matter what.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you very much.